The call from Ms. Johnson's office was falling apart. The merger, the deal that would save her company, was crashing in real time. In the back of the sleek Mercedes, Ms. Johnson's fingers trembled as she dialed yet another number, her eyes wide with panic. "Where are my interpreters?" she shouted into the phone, her voice cracking with desperation. The words cut through the car like a blade. She snapped her head to the side, glaring at the man sitting beside her. "Mr. Mason, keep your hands off my car," she hissed. The venom in her voice was unmistakable, leaving no room for misunderstanding. "You're the help. Stay in your lane." Mr. Mason's hand froze just inches from the radio dial, his fingers hovering as if he'd been struck by lightning. His jaw tightened, but his gaze stayed fixed on the road ahead, the tension in the air palpable. "Put the partition up," Ms. Johnson muttered, barely containing the fury in her voice. "I'm tired of seeing your face in my mirror." With a soft hiss, the partition slid up between them, cutting off the view. Ms. Johnson returned to her frantic phone calls, but her words, filled with mounting panic, seemed to only make things worse. "Where's my interpreter? I don't care what it costs," she yelled, her voice rising as she paced like a trapped animal in the back seat. "This is a billion-dollar deal, and you're telling me there's no one left to translate?" Her mascara was smudged under her eyes, her perfectly styled hair falling apart with each passing second of chaos. She was a woman on the edge, everything she'd worked for slipping away. Jerome, her driver, Mr. Mason, watched her through the rearview mirror, but his expression was unreadable. His mind wasn't on the panic unfolding in the back seat. He'd heard enough of these conversations over the years to know the truth. Johnson Enterprises was 3 months away from bankruptcy. This merger wasn't just business. It was survival. The fate of 200 jobs hung in the balance, including his own. When Ms. Johnson's phone call was cut off for the 10th time, she slammed the device in her lap, her hands shaking. "No, this can't happen. We can't lose this deal," she murmured, her voice barely audible. "If we don't close this, we lose everything." Mr. Mason had heard her talk about the company's struggles before, but today it felt different. He had a choice. He could stay silent and watch her drown in the weight of her own pride, or he could do something about it. With a quiet resolve, he pressed the button on the partition. The glass slid down, and he cleared his throat. "Excuse me, Ms. Johnson," he said, his tone calm and steady. She whipped around, eyes blazing with fury. "I told you to. What languages do you need?" Her words faltered. She stared at him, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. "You're asking me, what?" she stammered, clearly taken aback. Mr. Mason didn't flinch. His voice was quiet, controlled, and professional. "For your merger meeting, Ms. Johnson, what languages do you need?" A heavy silence filled the car. Ms. Johnson's phone fell from her hand, her gaze fixed on Mr. Mason's reflection in the mirror. "Japanese," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Mandarin, Hindi." Mr. Mason nodded, his tone unwavering. "Korean, Arabic, Portuguese, French, Spanish. I speak them all, fluently." The car seemed to stop moving in that moment. Ms. Johnson's breath hitched, and the world outside the tinted windows blurred. "You're telling me you speak 9 languages?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. He nodded once, as if the answer was the simplest thing in the world. "Would you like me to demonstrate?" he asked. Before she could respond, the phone in her hand rang. The caller ID made her stomach drop. Nakamura Patel Holdings. Her face drained of color as she stared at the screen like it might explode. "I can't answer this without an interpreter," she murmured, her pride and desperation warring inside her. Mr. Mason extended his hand toward the partition. "May I?" The words hung in the air like smoke, but the phone kept ringing. Ms. Johnson hesitated, a battle raging inside her. She couldn't do it. She couldn't let him help. But the phone kept ringing, a reminder that the world wouldn't wait for her pride. With a deep breath, she handed it over. Moshi Nakamura-san," Mr. Mason answered, his voice suddenly transforming. Gone was the careful distance. In its place, a commanding, cultured authority. The voice on the other end responded in rapid Japanese. Jerome listened intently, nodding occasionally. The transformation was nothing short of breathtaking. Ms. Johnson sat frozen, her gaze locked on him through the rearview mirror. This was no longer her driver. The man who had been invisible to her for 3 years was now her lifeline. The conversation continued in fluid, rapid exchanges, Jerome's voice shifting seamlessly between languages. Japanese flowed effortlessly from his lips, followed by Mandarin, Hindi, and then back to English. His words were like a masterful symphony, each note perfectly placed. Ms. Johnson's mind raced as she watched him navigate the phone call with a level of grace and expertise she never could have imagined. The call had started as a lifeline, her lifeline, but what she didn't know was that it was now her reckoning. Jerome's voice was no longer just the calm presence in the front seat. It was the voice of authority, the voice of someone who had been hiding in plain sight, someone who understood not just the languages of business, but the intricate dance of diplomacy that her company had been missing all along. The Nakamura team had already started their barrage of questions. But as Jerome answered each query, his tone softening, adjusting with the subtlety of a seasoned negotiator, it became clear he wasn't just interpreting, he was steering the ship. "Ms. Johnson," he said, his voice dropping slightly, "they've misunderstood your approach." Her heart skipped a beat. Misunderstood what? How? She was barely holding it together. Jerome's eyes never left the rearview mirror. "They think you view them as subordinates, not partners," he replied calmly. The language in the preliminary contracts was too aggressive, too domineering. "You've insulted their family business legacy." Ms. Johnson's blood ran cold. She had always been a bulldozer in the boardroom, but this was far beyond a simple business misunderstanding. The stakes were rising. Fast. The silence in the car was suffocating as Jerome continued his diplomatic maneuvering. His voice now took on a note of apology as he spoke once more in Japanese. The tension in the call seemed to melt away with his words. She could see it in his posture, the quiet confidence, the sheer authority in how he carried himself. Her mind was spinning, trying to catch up. "What did you say to them?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Jerome didn't look at her. His gaze remained fixed on the road ahead as he spoke. "I told them that Sterling Enterprises deeply respects their family's business legacy. I explained that you've been personally studying Japanese business customs to show proper honor." Ms. Johnson's mouth fell open. "But I haven't been doing that," she exclaimed. "You have now," Jerome replied simply. The sound of the phone being passed back in her hands felt like the world shifting. She stared at it for a moment, as if seeing it for the first time. Everything she knew was crumbling, but someone had just pulled it back from the brink. As the conversation came to an end, Ms. Johnson could barely breathe. The Nakamura team, who had been moments away from walking away, were now eager to meet with her in person. The merger, against all odds, was back on track. But the question that lingered, burning in her chest, was this: who was Jerome Mason? Her mind was reeling as the partition slid back down. She had been so sure of herself, so confident in the world she had built, but in a matter of moments, everything had changed. Jerome had saved her company, but what did that mean for her? For him? Ms. Johnson glanced at him as they pulled into the parking garage of Johnson Enterprises. He parked the car with the same calm precision he had used when navigating international business deals just moments ago. She wasn't sure how to feel. Grateful? Confused? Ashamed? "Mr. Mason," she said, her voice faltering as she spoke his name for the first time in years. "I need to know everything." He met her eyes in the rearview mirror. For the first time, they were equals. PhD in International Relations from Lincoln University. Master's in Applied Linguistics from Oak Ridge University, he began quietly. 22 years as a senior diplomatic translator for the State Department. I specialized in high-stakes multinational negotiations, G7 summits, trade agreements, crisis mediation. Each word he spoke hit her like a physical blow. She couldn't breathe. She had no idea. All this time, she had been paying a man with the most distinguished resume she had ever heard of, and she hadn't even noticed. I didn't know," she whispered. Jerome gave a small, almost imperceptible smile. "I applied for over 300 positions in my field. Overqualified for most, too old for others. I needed work. Victoria's stomach churned. So, you became a driver? She asked, her voice tight with disbelief. I became whatever I needed to be to survive, he replied, his tone even. The weight of the truth settled over her, and her hands started to shake again. Your mother's medical bills and your daughter's tuition, she murmured, her mind piecing together everything she had overheard over the years. Jerome didn't respond, but the quiet in the car spoke volumes. His sacrifices, his pride, his resilience. Why didn't you ever say something? Offer help? She asked, her voice cracking as she finally let the question out. Would you have listened? Jerome's voice was gentle, but it cut through her. You wouldn't have. Victoria sank back in her seat, feeling the weight of her ignorance and arrogance. How many times had she ignored the man who had saved her company today, who had been quietly carrying the weight of his past, while helping her carry the burden of her own? Her phone buzzed, snapping her from the spiral of regret. A text from her assistant, Ms. Harris. Nakamura team has arrived. They're in the lobby. The cold reality of what was to come hit her like a wave. This was just the beginning. Ms. Johnson stood at the entrance of the conference room, her mind still processing everything that had happened. The once invisible man who had been nothing more than a chauffeur had just saved her empire, but it was more than that. Jerome Mason wasn't just an employee, he was a force. She glanced at him, standing next to her, his presence so different now. No longer the man behind the wheel, but the man who had just single-handedly turned around a $1.2 billion deal. Will you help me save my company? She asked, her voice unsteady. Jerome met her gaze, straightened his jacket, and nodded. Let's go save your company, Ms. Johnson. As they walked into the room, the familiar hum of the corporate world seemed to fade. The delegation from Nakamura Patel Holdings was already seated at the table, their eyes trained on the two of them as they entered. The room fell silent. Mr. Young Nakamura, the patriarch of the Nakamura family, rose from his seat. His presence was calm, yet commanding, like a stone standing against the tide. The others in the room followed suit, their respectful bow signaling a cultural custom that, until now, Ms. Johnson had struggled to navigate. Jerome, standing at her side, bowed deeply in return, his movements fluid and natural. He spoke in formal Japanese, a tone of respect and authority that Ms. Johnson couldn't have matched even if she had tried. The surprise in Nakamura's eyes was unmistakable as he responded with an enthusiasm that Ms. Johnson had never seen before. The weight in the room shifted instantly. What did you tell him? Ms. Johnson whispered, her voice tinged with both awe and confusion. Jerome turned slightly to face her, his voice low but assured. That Sterling Enterprises is honored by his presence and grateful for the wisdom of his family's business legacy. Ms. Johnson's heart skipped a beat. How had he known exactly what to say? How had he, a man who had been reduced to driving her to Starbucks just days ago, stepped into the role of a cultural expert? No, a leader. The first hour of the meeting proceeded smoothly, with Jerome translating technical specifications between 3 languages while managing the subtle cultural nuances that could derail the entire merger. He wasn't just translating, he was conducting diplomacy. His expertise was shaping the room, gently guiding it toward understanding and respect. But then, a new challenge arose. Ms. Patel, sharp-eyed and direct, suddenly stopped speaking mid-sentence. Her expression darkened, and she turned to her assistant, speaking rapidly in Hindi. The tension in the room thickened. I'm sorry, Ms. Patel said, her voice firm. We've just discovered a serious issue with your company's security protocols. We cannot proceed with a company that has such loose security measures. Ms. Johnson's blood ran cold. The deal that had seemed so close to salvation was now slipping through her fingers. Her mind raced to recall any issues with their security systems, but nothing stood out. Jerome, however, remained calm. He leaned forward slightly, his voice steady as he addressed the issue. Ms. Patel, he began, speaking in Hindi to her assistant. May I ask what specific security concerns you've identified? The assistant whispered something in her ear. Jerome's eyes narrowed as he listened. Then, With quiet authority, he turned to the room. The security breach Ms. Patel refers to was resolved just yesterday evening. Sterling Enterprises' Mumbai team detected the intrusion attempt and implemented immediate countermeasures. Jerome explained smoothly. Ms. Patel stared at him, her face a mask of disbelief. "You coordinated this?" she asked. Jerome didn't flinch. "Yes, and I've already been in touch with your regional director, Mr. Wright, to confirm the resolution. The attempted breach was unsuccessful, and we've identified the competitor responsible." Ms. Patel's eyes widened, and she glanced at her assistant, who nodded slowly. "Shall I make the call to confirm?" Jerome asked, his voice cool and professional. The room fell silent as the weight of the situation hung in the air. But just as quickly, Ms. Patel gave a subtle nod, and Jerome pulled out his phone, dialing Mr. Wright in Mumbai. The call lasted 20 minutes, with Jerome seamlessly switching between Hindi, English, and legal terminology as he mediated the situation. When it ended, Ms. Patel's posture had softened, and the tension that had once filled the room was now replaced by a quiet respect. "Mr. Mason," Ms. Patel said, her voice no longer as sharp, "your response time was impressive." Jerome nodded respectfully. Sterling Enterprises takes partnership security very seriously, especially with organizations we hope to build lasting relationships with. Mr. Young Nakamura spoke quietly from across the room, his voice measured but filled with concern. "I must ask," he said, looking at Ms. Johnson, "if Sterling truly understands the commitment required for a partnership that will span generations." The question hung in the air like a weighted ball, and Ms. Johnson's heart sank. She had heard the words before: long-term partnership, generational commitment. But had she ever truly understood what they meant? Jerome turned to face Ms. Johnson, his eyes filled with quiet determination. "Mr. Nakamura," he said in perfect Japanese, his voice calm, yet filled with a subtle power, "Sterling Enterprises understands the meaning of honor. We understand that true partnerships honor not just the business, but the people, the families, and the legacies involved." The room fell completely silent. Even Ms. Patel, who had been so focused on the financial side of things, seemed to listen intently. The weight of Jerome's words sank deep into the room, and for the first time in this entire meeting, Ms. Johnson could see it. She could see what Jerome had been trying to show her all along. It wasn't just about contracts. It was about the people. Mr. Nakamura's expression softened, and he nodded slowly. "Sterling Enterprises understands the meaning of respect," he said, "and that's something I value deeply." Jerome looked back at Ms. Johnson, his expression calm, his mission complete. But the biggest test was yet to come. The room seemed to breathe in unison as the tension that had held everyone captive began to dissolve. But just as Ms. Johnson allowed herself to relax, Mr. Carter, the chief technology officer, suddenly spoke up, his voice cutting through the calm. "I found something," he said, his voice tight with concern. He pointed to a specific clause in the contract, his face troubled. "There's a potential patent conflict in the AI algorithms. Something our legal teams missed." Ms. Johnson's stomach lurched. This was it, the moment that could derail everything. Patent disputes, especially one as serious as this, could completely destroy the deal. She felt her pulse quicken. "What's wrong?" she asked, trying to mask the panic rising in her chest. Jerome's expression turned serious as he studied the details presented by Mr. Carter. The room fell into a heavy silence as everyone waited for his response. Jerome didn't look at Ms. Johnson. Instead, his focus remained fixed on the technical documents in front of him. "It's not as severe as it seems," he said, his voice steady. "The similarity you're seeing is only superficial. The neural network architecture here is completely different from the patent held by BYU." Ms. Johnson blinked, trying to grasp the depth of what he was saying. "Wait, what do you mean? Are we at risk of a lawsuit?" Jerome leaned forward, his tone measured but confident. "No, the algorithms may look similar, but the way they process data is fundamentally different. What we're seeing is a coincidence of overlapping patterns, not a violation." He turned to Mr. Carter and spoke in rapid Mandarin, his technical knowledge flowing effortlessly. The exchange was quick, fluid, so fast that Ms. Johnson had trouble keeping up. "Mr. Carter, Jerome continued, switching back to English. The patent issue here is more about surface-level resemblance. If we were to run a deeper analysis of the underlying structure, we'd see that Sterling's algorithm is far more advanced. Mr. Carter studied the documents again, clearly weighing Jerome's words. Slowly, a smile spread across his face. "Well, I'll be damned," he muttered under his breath, clearly impressed. He turned to the rest of the room. "This is not just a close call. This is a clean sweep. No issues at all." The room collectively exhaled. The biggest threat to the merger had been defused, but the underlying issue remained. Who was this man, Jerome Mason? How had he become so well-versed in everything from law to AI? And why had he never spoken up before? Ms. Patel, who had been quiet until now, exchanged a look with Mr. Young Nakamura. They seemed to be processing what had just transpired. The transformation in the room was palpable. The skepticism from earlier had disappeared, replaced by respect, true respect. But there was still one last hurdle. "You've handled this better than anyone I've ever worked with," Ms. Patel said, her voice tinged with admiration. "But there's one more thing I need to know, Mr. Mason. Why weren't you more involved in these discussions before?" The question hung in the air, and Ms. Johnson's heart skipped a beat. She had been asking herself the same thing. Why hadn't Jerome spoken up sooner? Jerome, ever the diplomat, met her gaze for the first time in what felt like hours. His expression softened, but there was no anger, no bitterness, only quiet resignation. "Because it wasn't my place," he said, his voice calm. "For 3 years, I've been your driver, Ms. Johnson, and I did that job as best I could. But today was different." The word struck Ms. Johnson like a thunderclap. Today was different. She had been blind to him for so long, dismissing him as nothing more than an employee who drove her to coffee meetings and waited for her outside boardrooms. But now everything had changed. Jerome wasn't just her driver. He was her equal, her savior. And, whether she liked it or not, he was the one who would help her transform the future of her company. "I'm sorry," Ms. Johnson whispered, her voice cracking. The weight of everything she had missed, everything she had overlooked, hit her all at once. Jerome's eyes softened. "It's not about apologies, Ms. Johnson," he said gently. "It's about what we do next." The room was silent for a moment as the magnitude of the moment settled in. Ms. Patel and Mr. Young Nakamura exchanged a glance, clearly considering what had just transpired. They had come to the meeting expecting a standard business negotiation, but what they had encountered was something far more profound. A story of second chances, of talent hidden in plain sight, and of a man who had quietly bided his time until the moment was right. "We're not done yet," Jerome added, breaking the silence. "But we're close." Ms. Johnson took a deep breath and turned to face her team. She had spent years building this empire, but now it felt like she was seeing it through a new lens. Everything had changed. "We've got work to do," she said, her voice firm and resolute. "And we're going to do it right." As the meeting continued, Ms. Johnson felt a sense of purpose she hadn't known in years. She wasn't just fighting for a deal anymore. She was fighting for something bigger. She was fighting for respect, for her team, for the legacy she hoped to leave behind. And at the center of it all, standing right beside her, was the man who had made it all possible. Mr. Jerome Mason. The meeting had shifted. What was once a tense and precarious negotiation was now a room filled with possibilities. Jerome Mason, the man who had once been relegated to the shadows, was now the linchpin of this entire merger. But for Ms. Johnson, the realization of how far she had been from understanding Jerome's true worth lingered like a bitter aftertaste. The air in the room had cleared, but she knew there was still much to do. She could feel the weight of the upcoming decisions pressing down on her shoulders. Every choice she made now would be scrutinized, not just by the board, not just by the Nakamura Patel team, but by the very people who had once dismissed Jerome. The executives of Johnson Enterprises, the ones who had barely glanced at him before, were now seeing him for who he truly was. They had underestimated the power of a single individual, the sheer potential locked inside a man who had been too humble to demand recognition. Ms. Johnson stood, her thoughts focused but her voice steady. "We have a lot of work ahead of us, but we're on the right track. We've made it past the biggest hurdles, and I couldn't have done it without Mr. Mason. The shift in tone was subtle but unmistakable. No longer was she the woman in charge, barking orders from the top down. She was part of something larger now. A team. A force. Her eyes found Jerome, standing across the room, looking every bit the professional he was. He wasn't just a driver anymore. He wasn't just the man who had saved her company from the edge of ruin. He was a partner, a decision-maker, and more than that, a person she could trust to lead in ways she couldn't have imagined. The boardroom door swung open, and Ms. Harris, her assistant, entered with a stack of papers in hand. Her eyes flicked from Ms. Johnson to Jerome and back again. Ms. Johnson, Ms. Harris began, the Nakamura Patel team is ready for the final meeting. Ms. Johnson nodded, but her mind was elsewhere. How had she let this go on for so long? How had she ignored the talent standing right in front of her? Mr. Mason, she said, her voice suddenly serious. Are you ready? Jerome didn't flinch. His confidence, the quiet strength he had shown in the face of overwhelming pressure, was now his greatest asset. Always. She nodded and turned back to the rest of the room. Let's finish this the right way. As they moved toward the conference room, the atmosphere had completely changed. There was no longer a sense of desperation, no longer a need for frantic last-minute maneuvers. What was about to unfold would be the culmination of years of hard work, by everyone, not just by Ms. Johnson, but by Jerome as well. The Nakamura Patel team was already seated. Their expressions were guarded, but something was different now. There was a respect in the air that hadn't been there before. Ms. Johnson and Jerome entered together, side by side. The moment they crossed the threshold, the room fell into a hush. The delegation rose, as customary, and Jerome bowed in return, a gesture of deep respect that had become second nature to him. Mr. Nakamura, Jerome said in flawless Japanese, it is an honor to continue this discussion. The lead executive of the Nakamura Patel team, Mr. Nakamura himself, nodded appreciatively. We are grateful for the time and effort your team has put in, he said, his voice carrying the weight of years in business. We are now ready to finalize our agreement. But before they could proceed, Ms. Patel, always sharp and direct, spoke again. There is one final question we must address, she said, her voice steady. Mr. Mason's role. We need to be sure that there will be no conflicts moving forward. Ms. Johnson took a deep breath, feeling the familiar pang of insecurity rise in her chest. What would they say? What would they think of Jerome taking such a prominent role? But Jerome was already steps ahead. His presence in the room was no longer just that of a translator. He was the embodiment of quiet authority. I have been listening to your concerns, he began, his voice firm, and I understand your reservations. But my role here is clear. I am not just an interpreter. I am here as an equal, as a partner in this deal, someone who understands the complexities of both your cultures and your business. Together, we will move this company forward in a way that honors both our legacies. The room was silent. Even Ms. Patel seemed to soften, her sharp features relaxing just enough to acknowledge the truth in his words. Ms. Johnson glanced at Jerome, and for the first time, she truly saw him. Not as a driver, not as an employee, but as someone who had been hidden in plain sight, waiting for the right moment to shine. She spoke, her voice carrying more weight than it had ever held before. Jerome Mason will lead our international relations from this moment on. His expertise will be integral to the future of this company. There is no one more qualified than he is. The room froze, the air thick with the unspoken shock of the moment. No one had expected her to speak those words so publicly. But Ms. Johnson didn't flinch. She was making a statement, a declaration. In the room, her team, the Nakamura Patel delegation, and even herself, had no choice but to accept it. Mr. Nakamura looked over at Jerome, his expression unreadable. For a moment, it seemed as if time itself had stopped. Then, he nodded once, slowly, almost imperceptibly. I believe this partnership will be one for the ages. The silence that followed Mr. Nakamura's statement felt heavier than the weight of the entire room. The deal, which had seemed so precarious just hours ago, was now moving toward completion. But as much as Ms. Johnson wanted to celebrate, She knew the real test was still ahead. The next few hours passed in a blur. There were final revisions to be made to the contracts, clarifications on intellectual property, and technical discussions about the integration of both company systems. But no matter how many issues were ironed out, one fact remained undeniable. Jerome Mason was no longer just a driver. He was at the helm of something much bigger, something that was destined to transform Johnson Enterprises in ways no one had ever imagined. As the last of the discussions wound down and the deal was officially sealed, Ms. Johnson found herself staring at the room around her. The Nakamura Patel team, their faces etched with satisfaction, were shaking hands and exchanging final pleasantries with the executives of her company. But she wasn't watching them. She was watching Jerome. He stood across the room, now fully transformed into the man he was always meant to be. No longer confined to the back seat, he was the one who had driven this deal to completion. His posture was straight, his gaze unwavering. He exuded the quiet confidence of someone who had long been underestimated, but now had the world's attention. "Mr. Mason," she said, walking toward him with purpose. He turned to face her, his expression neutral, but his eyes filled with something more, something deeper. Understanding, respect, and perhaps just a hint of pride. "We did it," she said, her voice soft but filled with awe. Jerome nodded, but his gaze never wavered. "You did it, Ms. Johnson. You were the one who gave me the chance. You gave me the platform to show what I can do. This is as much your victory as it is mine." Ms. Johnson shook her head, the weight of his words hitting her harder than she had anticipated. "No, Jerome. You saved us. You saved my company. You saved everything I've worked for." He gave a small smile. "And now it's time for something bigger." Before she could respond, the door to the conference room opened, and Ms. Harris stepped inside, her face flushed with excitement. "Ms. Johnson," she began, her voice shaky, "you need to come quickly. The board is waiting for you upstairs." Ms. Johnson nodded, her mind already shifting gears. "I'll be right there." She turned back to Jerome. "You're with me." As they made their way up to the boardroom, Ms. Johnson couldn't shake the feeling that something had fundamentally changed. This was no longer just about business. This was personal. Jerome Mason was not just an employee. He was family, someone who had become integral to her success in a way she never could have imagined. When they entered the boardroom, the room fell silent. The board members, who had once been skeptical of Jerome's qualifications, now looked at him with a mixture of awe and respect. They had seen the transformation happen in real time, had watched as this quiet, reserved man became the backbone of the company's future. Ms. Johnson walked to the head of the table, her gaze scanning the room. "I've just spoken with Mr. Nakamura," she began. "The deal is finalized. We have a $1.2 billion partnership in place. We've secured our future." The board members exchanged shocked looks, some of them still trying to process the enormity of the news. "But there's one thing you need to know," Ms. Johnson continued, her voice steady. "Everything that happens from this moment on, everything, will be done with a new vision, a new direction. And at the heart of that vision will be Jerome Mason." The room fell into an awkward silence as the board members tried to process her words. Jerome, standing beside her, was calm but undeniably present. There was no more hiding, no more pretending. "Mr. Mason," Ms. Johnson said, her voice carrying a quiet authority, "will be promoted to Senior Vice President of International Relations. Effective immediately." The shock that followed was palpable. The board members' faces twisted with disbelief, their eyes darting to each other, questioning whether they had heard her correctly. "Ms. Johnson," one of the executives began, but she held up her hand, cutting him off. "Do I have your support?" she asked, her gaze sweeping the room, meeting every pair of eyes with quiet intensity. The silence stretched for a moment before Mr. Walker, one of the senior board members, spoke up. "Ms. Johnson, we support you. We support this decision." The other members nodded, albeit hesitantly. But the fact was undeniable. They had seen Jerome in action. They had witnessed his expertise, his unwavering dedication, and the quiet strength he brought to the table. They had no choice but to accept the reality. The room shifted. The uncertainty that had plagued the board for so long was slowly melting away. Jerome Mason was no longer just the man behind the wheel. He was an executive. He was a leader. And he was going to reshape Johnson Enterprises in ways they hadn't even dreamed possible. As Ms. Johnson stood in front of the board, she couldn't help but feel a surge of pride. Not just for herself, but for Jerome. He had never once asked for recognition. He had never once demanded a seat at the table. But he had earned it, and then some. Ms. Johnson turned to him, her eyes softening. "I can't thank you enough, Jerome. You've saved us. You've saved my legacy." Jerome's eyes met hers, filled with quiet determination. "We saved it, Ms. Johnson. Together." The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of activity. Ms. Johnson's decision to promote Jerome Mason to Senior Vice President of International Relations sent shockwaves throughout Johnson Enterprises. But it wasn't just about the promotion. It was about everything that came with it. The transformation of the company, the shift in culture, and the dawning realization that talent could exist in places they had never thought to look. Jerome quickly became a cornerstone of the company's strategy. His cultural intelligence division, which he had designed himself, was proving to be invaluable. No longer were deals limited by communication barriers or cultural misunderstandings. Jerome's ability to seamlessly translate not just language, but intentions had opened doors that had once seemed firmly shut. Ms. Johnson watched in awe as the transformation took shape. She had given him the reins, but what she didn't realize at the time was just how much he had been carrying all along. Jerome didn't just fix problems, he anticipated them. And with each new success, her admiration for him deepened. One evening, as the sun began to set over the city, Ms. Johnson found herself in her office, staring out the window. Her phone buzzed. A message from Jerome. "We've received an invitation from Nakamura Patel Holdings. They want us to collaborate on a joint venture. Your presence is required in Singapore next month for the Global Partners Conference. This is bigger than we imagined." Ms. Johnson's heart raced as she read the message. She had always dreamed of international success, but this was something else. They were no longer just trying to survive. They were building a legacy. She typed a quick response. "I'm ready. Let's do this." The days leading up to the conference were filled with intense preparation. Jerome worked tirelessly with his team, briefing everyone on cultural protocols, negotiation tactics, and the specifics of the partnership. He even took the time to walk Ms. Johnson through every detail, making sure she was as prepared as possible. It was during one of their late-night prep sessions when Ms. Johnson realized just how far they had come. She had sat across from so many people, investors, business partners, and executives over the years. But no one had ever made her feel as seen, as understood, as Jerome had. "You know," she said, leaning back in her chair, "I've spent so many years in this industry, always thinking I knew what was best for the company. But it wasn't until I saw things from your perspective that I really understood how much we had been missing." Jerome looked up from his notes, his expression softening. "We're just getting started, Ms. Johnson. This is only the beginning." The day of the conference arrived, and Ms. Johnson stood beside Jerome in Singapore's gleaming skyline, the weight of the moment pressing down on her. Thousands of executives from across the world filled the grand hall, each of them eager to see what this merger, this once impossible union, would bring. As they entered the venue, the atmosphere was electric, but there was something different this time. Ms. Johnson was no longer the only one in the spotlight. Jerome was with her, standing tall beside her, and his presence was undeniable. He had earned his place at the table, not as a servant, but as an equal. The Nakamura Patel team had been waiting for them. Their faces were warm with respect, but the unspoken recognition was clear. This deal had been made possible because of Jerome's vision, his skill, and his unwavering belief in second chances. Ms. Johnson, standing at the podium, addressed the audience with a newfound confidence. Her words flowed smoothly as she introduced the vision for the future of Johnson Enterprises. But even as she spoke, her eyes kept drifting to Jerome. He wasn't just her partner now. He was the person who had helped her see beyond her own limitations, who had taught her that real leadership wasn't about titles. It was about recognizing the people around you and empowering them to reach their full potential. The presentation ended with a standing ovation, but as Ms. Johnson looked out over the crowd, she knew this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning of something much bigger, something that would change the way business was done, not just at Johnson Enterprises, but in every company that dared to see talent differently. Later that evening, as the conference concluded, Ms. Johnson and Jerome found themselves standing at the balcony of their hotel, overlooking the city lights. The weight of the day's events hung heavy in the air, but there was a quiet sense of accomplishment between them. "You did it," Ms. Johnson said, her voice filled with awe. "You changed everything." Jerome smiled, a rare warmth in his eyes. "No, Ms. Johnson, we did it. Together." For the first time, she truly understood the meaning of partnership. It wasn't about hierarchy. It was about mutual respect, understanding, and the willingness to stand side by side, no matter the odds. As the night stretched on, Ms. Johnson couldn't help but think about how far they had come. From the broken deal in the back seat of the car to standing at the forefront of an international partnership, everything had changed. But more importantly, she had changed. "I'll never make the same mistake again," she said softly, almost to herself. Jerome turned to her, his eyes calm, but filled with knowing. "You don't have to," he replied. "You've already done it right. And now we build." As the city buzzed beneath them, a sense of peace settled over Ms. Johnson. She wasn't just looking at the future of her company anymore. She was looking at the future of the world she was helping to build, a world where people were seen for who they really were. The story had come full circle, and this time, the future was brighter than ever before. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more thrilling, cinematic stories just like this one. Here's a quick question for you. What's your story of discovering hidden talent? Have you ever underestimated someone, only to realize their true worth later? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and let's keep this conversation going. Thank you for the journey, and remember, talent doesn't wear uniforms. It wears potential.